At least 56 people have been killed and more than 213 injured in a stampede during the funeral of the Iranian general who was killed by a US drone strike on Friday. Massive crowds gathered to pay tribute to Commander Soleimani, and the burial was delayed until this evening due to the fatalities. It comes as the European Union's diplomatic chief voiced concern at Tehran's latest step away from the 2015 nuclear deal. The general's death continues to ripple through the region, with the US and its allies on alert for any retaliation. In a minute, we'll hear from our political editor on the challenge for the UK and our Washington correspondent on the president's gamble. But first, let's go to Beirut and our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman. Jonathan.
Matt, as you say, over 50 killed or 50 dead at this funeral, with over 200 injured. But the numbers may rise because they have been rising all day. Essentially what happened was that General Soleimani's funeral cortege set off in this small town of Kerman, and there were so many people on the streets that a stampede developed and people were killed as a result, though I'm told that the general's body has now been transferred to a martyrs section of a cemetery in Kerman for burial. At the same time, the Iranians have been ratcheting up the rhetoric of retaliation. The Secretary of Iran's National Security Council has talked of 13 so-called revenge scenarios being considered. The response, he says, likely to include medium and long-range missiles. And this official describing even the weakest response that Iran might give as being a historic nightmare for the Americans. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has reportedly himself said that to his Security Council that the response must be direct, proportional, openly carried out by the Iranians themselves, in other words, not by their proxies. And this is what General Salami, the head of the Revolutionary Guard, the unit that General Soleimani was also part of, had to say to mourners in Kerman earlier today.
حرف آخر را اول میزنم. انتقام میگیریم. انتقام میگیریم. سخت، محکم، پشیمان کننده، قاطع و تمام کننده. مطمئن باشید، آرام باشید.
And Jonathan, is there anything actually happening on the diplomatic front?
Well, the good news that we can see is that President Macron of France, who's very much taking the lead for the Europeans on this, has spoken to President Rouhani of Iran today. The bad news is that Mohammad Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, who's normally proved a bridge with the regime in the past, has been denied a visa to go to New York, where he was due to address a session of the United Nations on Thursday. Mr. Zarif is himself now threatening retaliation. The British ambassador in Iran, Rob McCare, has been summoned to the Foreign Ministry and warned that the UK should not be, in the Iranians' words, a partner in American terrorism. And the British, the French and the Germans, who've been meeting with other European foreign ministers today, really have to decide whether the Iran nuclear deal is now officially dead, given that the Iranians have said that there will be no limit on enriching uranium, which in theory could be used to build a nuclear bomb. And that's very important because it means if the nuclear deal really is officially dead, then the Europeans have to reimpose sanctions on Iran, which makes this diplomatic crisis even worse and the security situation even worse. In Iraq, some 20 British military planners have arrived to try and work out what to do next with these 400 British troops whose safety is, of course, of paramount importance. They are there in a training capacity, though they're not doing any training at the moment. They are in the business of protecting themselves. So I think it is fair to say that this crisis does not look any closer to being resolution. In fact, it looks just as worrying as it did when it first erupted with the assassination of General Soleimani last Friday.
Jonathan Rugman in Beirut, thanks very much indeed. Well, the Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has told MPs that some British personnel in Iraq have been moved from Baghdad to a secure military base for safety following the killing of General Soleimani. The training of Iraqi troops has also been suspended. Mr. Wallace said that there was a case to be made that America acted in self-defence in killing the Iranian general. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said it was widely regarded as an illegal act and accused the government of failing to stand up to America in the hope of securing a post-Brexit trade deal. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, reports.
Happy New Year, Mr. Speaker.
Parliament's first day back after the Christmas break. Its first chance to discuss the killing of Iran's General Qasem Soleimani. In Tehran, Iran's parliament. Chants of death to America. Revenge, revenge. Here, the Defence Secretary edged close to saying the US-targeted bombing of the Iranian general was a justified act.
From the information and intelligence that I have seen, what I could say is that it is clear there was a case for self-defence to be made by an individual who had come to Iraq to coordinate murder and attacks on US citizens.
Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that he's scared to stand up to President Trump because he's hitched his wagon to the prospect of a toxic Trump trade deal? Instead, Mr. Speaker, at this highly dangerous moment, we find the government giving cover and even expressing sympathy for what is widely regarded as an illegal act because they're so determined to keep in with President Trump.
In Brussels, the Foreign Secretary, after this meeting on Libya, held talks with his French and German counterparts on a common approach to Iran. But all sides wonder if the current agreement between these three will last if the EU condemns a future US act, and Britain doesn't. The Defence Secretary announced that UK soldiers had now stopped their training programme for Iraqi troops and were focused on protecting themselves and other British nationals in Iraq. Many of them now holed up in bases like this one outside Baghdad. He said officials had been flown out to plan for a possible evacuation. There are 400 British soldiers in Iraq, 1,000 civilian workers. He said a new warning to British shipping around the Strait of Hormuz was imminent.
Could he tell us where the Prime Minister is? And what is he doing that's so much more important than addressing Parliament on the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani?
The Leader of the Opposition asked where the Prime Minister is. Well, funnily enough, the Prime Minister is running the country, Mr. Speaker, something the Leader of the Opposition will fail to ever do.
Boris Johnson has not made a public appearance since this pre-Christmas visit to British troops in Estonia 16 days ago. Much could depend on his judgment call if allies are prized apart by events. The Defence Secretary said the government was checking out allegations that the US was refusing a visa to the Iranian Foreign Minister for a visit he might make to the United Nations in New York. But on the streets of Iran, the clamour is for revenge, not talks. The Iranian Foreign Minister himself said the US would receive a response to Friday's killings, delivering the utmost pain.
So the two messages coming out of the government here today is that word de-escalation, which we're going to hear again and again, trying to, through direct approaches and through regional players, try and persuade Iran not to take its act of revenge, make it so extreme that it is something that pushes America into a new realm of activity. The other main message coming out, of course, is how they're going to protect UK individuals, forces and civilians who are in Iraq. Other countries already moving people out. That could be the next phase of that story. But all the talk around Whitehall is the big strategic call that Boris Johnson could face if Iran serves up the dish of revenge in a way that does provoke America to another act which, say, the EU countries feel they cannot support. What will Boris Johnson do? As Foreign Secretary, he was there 2 years. He didn't really face a crisis like this. He didn't really often take on, that anyone can particularly remember, America. He knows President Trump doesn't like neutrals. How will he actually respond? We're not there yet. We may get a first flavour tomorrow at Prime Minister's Questions.
Gary, thanks very much. Well, in America, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has again declined to give evidence of the imminent threat which led to the drone strike on General Soleimani, saying the president had been given broad detail of the intelligence. It comes as lawmakers on Capitol Hill demand answers, and even some Republican senators are expressing criticism of President Trump's strategy on Iran. Our Washington correspondent Siobhan Kennedy joins us now. Siobhan.
Well, Kathy, the President is meeting with the Greek Prime Minister as we speak. We'll no doubt hear from him in the next few hours. And incidentally, it will be the first time he's appeared since returning from Christmas here to Washington, since he made that momentous decision to attack and kill General Qasem Soleimani, an attack that has led to multiple questions. What was the intelligence behind that killing? Why did the President act first without consulting Congress? And also confusion still about whether or not Iranian cultural sites are under threat, and what's the plan also for US troops in Iraq. But so far, to the frustration of Democrats and even some Republicans too, as you'll see in my piece to come, there have been very few answers, just ongoing preparations, Kathy, for what many see as an inevitable, imminent Iranian retaliation. Counting in the troops one by one, soldiers board in North Carolina. With just hours' notice, they head to the Middle East to bolster American forces. Their role, a deterrent, the US says, but not everyone agrees.
We're sending more troops to the Middle East. I see troops not as a deterrence to Iran, but as targets.
Republicans generally don't speak out against President Trump, but this is so important, Rand Paul has decided he has to.
The assassination of a major general from Iran really precludes any further diplomacy. With the death of Soleimani, I think it's the death of diplomacy. And I don't think military action will cure it. Are we more or less likely to have Iran wanting to develop nuclear weapons now? I think much more likely. Are we more or less likely to have them attack Americans? I think much more likely. So I don't see the advantage to this other than people feel good that they punished a bad man.
People, including the Senate Republicans, who posted this video on Twitter in support of the president's actions. But questions remain about the intelligence behind the attack, and mixed messages from the White House about the president's threat to target Iranian cultural sites. Then a letter from the commanding general in Iraq suggesting troop withdrawal, which was later described as a mistake.
And what we're seeing in the Pentagon right now is seems to be chaos and confusion, which is not good for U.S. interest.
What does the whole thing say about the strategy here? Do you think there is one?
I have not seen a strategy. I don't think there is a long-term strategy, and I think that's part of the questions that we need to ask, particularly with the action that was taken.
Perhaps this man, the National Security Advisor, could provide some clarity about why the U.S. struck when it did.
Strong evidence and strong intelligence, and unfortunately we're not going to be able to get into sources and methods at this time, but I can tell you it was very strong.
So what about the Secretary of State? Any more detail from him?
It's the right decision. We got it right. The Department of Defense did excellent work, and the President had a entirely legal, appropriate, and a basis, as well as a decision that fit perfectly within our strategy and how to counter the threat of malign activity from Iran more broadly.
Pompeo and the top military officials who provided the intelligence for the attack are tomorrow set to brief lawmakers. They'll want answers as to whether the president had enough evidence to act without first consulting Congress, and whether there's a plan other than the president's Twitter feed going forward. Senator, are you worried about the president's language, cranking up the language at a time when the stated aim is to de-escalate tensions, but the president seems to be doing the opposite? Are you worried about that?
Well, I think that I would prefer at least that the discussion about that occur between our generals and the president and his team, and not in the public.
I'm not in charge of the president's rhetoric one way.
Are you worried about it, though?
No, I slept well last night. I think we killed a very bad guy.
But unless the president can provide a strategy for what happens next, Congress is set to vote on a resolution later this week that will restrict the president's ability to send his troops to war.
Well, you just heard Republican Senator Rand Paul there in Siobhan's piece calling the strike the death of diplomacy. Earlier I spoke to Morgan Ortega from the US State Department and asked for her response.
So America is a thriving democracy, and we have many legislators in Congress that have a lot of opinions on policy, and that's what we do here in the United States is debate foreign policy, and every senator is, of course, entitled to their opinion. I can tell you on behalf of the Trump administration that we believe that the Iranian regime is solely responsible for their violent and flagrant acts in the region.
Now, the senator wasn't grieving for the general who was killed, and nor indeed are any of your allies in Europe. But the question really being asked is whether by this action you have made the world a more dangerous place because of the risks.
Yeah, so President Trump had a variety of risks to look at whenever it came to killing Qasem Soleimani. And clearly President Trump decided that the world would be a safer place.
But what makes you think that by removing one, albeit very important man, you have changed the entire policy of the state of Iran?
We may not have changed the entire policy of the state of Iran, but we have taken out the world's greatest terrorist, and that world is a safer place for it.
So is assassination of political opponents now part of your foreign policy?
It's not an assassination. No. I'm sorry, I got to argue with you there. The United States does not conduct assassinations.
But what was this then?
Completely take issue with how you characterize that.
What was this if not an assassination?
What's the question?
What was this if not an assassination?
We killed a terrorist. Qasem Soleimani is designated as a terrorist by the United Nations Security Council. Look it up.
He was a general representing a security branch of a nation state. He was not like Osama bin Laden hiding in someone's basement. He was not like al-Baghdadi who was hiding in a cave.
He was designated by the United Nations Security Council as a terrorist, the same as Osama bin Laden. It actually directly contradicts what you just said.
So how come your closest allies in the Middle East, the Israelis, have distanced themselves from this action? And how come previous presidents, including President Bush, who wasn't exactly missile shy, refused to take out, if I can use that awful word, General Soleimani?
I don't think that the Israelis have distanced themselves at all. In fact, I think that Israel is America's closest ally in the Middle East. We work closer with them now than ever. There was no one who had a greater threat from the Iranian regime directly than the state of Israel. So they understand this threat incredibly well. So I take issue with your analysis there. As it relates to why President Bush and why President Obama did not take those strikes, you'll certainly have to speak to their administrations. They had the opportunity. This should have happened a long time ago, and President Trump made a decision that should have happened before now.
Right. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking yesterday, said this has nothing to do with us. This is basically America's fight. This is America's issue. He said it very clearly.
I mean, you could look. I could point you to a dozen statements that you could Google from Prime Minister Netanyahu talking about the threat of Qasem Soleimani. I'm just not going to get into an argument with that. I think you're completely mischaracterizing. You're completely mischaracterizing the Israel position against Qasem Soleimani in Iran, and so we're just going to have to agree to disagree there.
What would you like your partners in Europe, your allies, your closest allies, Britain, to do now?
Yeah, well, we're very thankful that Foreign Minister Rob will be here at the State Department in just a few days. We work closer with the United Kingdom than almost any country on the planet, not just on issues related to the threat of Iran, but on the de-ISIS campaign. The UK has been instrumental in helping us to ensure the enduring defeat of the physical caliphate of ISIS. That fight continues. We work incredibly closely with the United Kingdom on the threat that the Chinese Communist Party poses. We work on trade issues. So this is a robust and strong relationship, and we're very much looking forward to having Secretary Rob here to meet with Secretary Pompeo.
And yet your boss, Secretary Pompeo, said last week, just a few days ago, that he was not very happy with the response from Europe. He wasn't hearing the kind of support, including from Britain, that he was expecting. Has that changed now?
So that was the timing of what you just said is important. The secretary did say that on Friday night. Yesterday morning, Monday morning, the E3 put out a statement that we felt was very strong, that lamented what Qasem Soleimani had done to the world, and we were very pleased with that statement.
And if you don't get the kind of support that you expect from Britain over the issue of this drone strike, will that have any impact on the Brexit negotiations, the trade negotiations with America after Brexit?
Not at all.
Okay. Short and sweet. Morgan Ortega, thank you. Joining us now from Tehran is Professor Mohammad Morandi, who's a professor at the University of Tehran. Thanks for coming back on the program, Professor. Let me ask you this, first of all. The Iranian government has outlined 13 revenge scenarios to be taken after the death of General Soleimani. Is that helping the current situation? Is that lowering the tensions or doing the opposite?
I don't see why Iran should lower the tensions. The United States carried out an act of war. They murdered a senior Iranian military official, they also murdered a senior Iraqi military official, thus carrying out an act of war against the Iraqi state. And General Qasem Soleimani was supposed to meet the Iraqi prime minister that morning, according to the prime minister himself the day before yesterday in parliament. And he was supposed to discuss with him a letter from the Saudis and to discuss some sort of rapprochement with the Saudis, because the Iraqi prime minister was mediating. The Iraqi prime minister also said that he told this to President Trump, and President Trump thanked him for it. So I think that it's quite obvious what happened. The narrative that the Americans have created that he was out to kill Americans is nonsense. The Americans lie all the time. They lied their way into Iraq through an illegal war. And Pompeo himself, the boss of the person you just spoke to, said when we were at the CIA, we were taught, we had courses on how to lie, cheat, and steal. Okay. And he said it with a laugh, and so did the audience. They too laughed.
Let me ask you this then. I mean, if there is going to be a military act of revenge, it will very likely provoke another act from the United States. Are you really saying that you're prepared to see a full-scale war involving Iran? I mean, I'm looking at all those cars, those commuters behind you. This will impact the lives of tens of thousands of ordinary Iranians. Is it really worth it?
If the Iranians do not retaliate, this will send a message to Trump that he can continue murdering people, that he can continue bombing people. That's what the United States is doing in Iraq. Right before murdering a senior Iranian official and a senior Iraqi official, which is unprecedented in contemporary history, he also bombed 30 Iraqi soldiers and murdered them. The US government informed the Iraqi prime minister that they were going to carry out the attack. The Iraqi prime minister said, don't do it. They did it anyway. He asked for the intelligence for the link between that group and the American contractor. They refused to give it to him.
Okay.
The contractor who was killed was 500 kilometers away from where these soldiers were. So the Americans are lying.
Okay, but
when the Americans behave with impunity and arrogance, the Iranians know the only way to protect themselves is to make them regret what they did.
Right. Very briefly, Professor, if I may, the United Nations, has put the late General Soleimani on a terrorist watch list. He has been accused by the Americans of being responsible for the loss of hundreds of American lives. And if you talk to Syrian citizens in places like Aleppo, they cheered the fact that he died because of their suffering caused by him in large part. Your response? Briefly.
First of all, I've been to Aleppo on numerous occasions. And I've been to Syria on numerous occasions since 2012 to 2017. I was in Aleppo when it was liberated. And I saw what the people of Aleppo were saying. The white helmets that you, in the West, you praise so much, their building was right beside the Nusra Front building, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria. So this is a narrative that no one accepts. I've been to many Syrian universities over the years, and they despise those extremist groups that the Saudis funded and the United States cooperated with to create. The United States and its allies, they are responsible for creating extremist groups in Syria.
Professor Morandi,
and
I'm sorry
ISIS
to
and
interrupt.
Al-Qaeda were about to capture Aleppo when General Soleimani pushed them back. And the same is true in Iraq.
I don't want to interrupt you, but we've
is not a
slightly
terrorist
run over
according
time.
to the UN.
Okay, we've run over time, so I'm going to have to leave it there. Professor Morandi, and of course the White Helmets denied everything you just said. Thanks for coming on the program.